the very beginning of the war.
Mr. Trump kicked Mr. Zelensky out of the White House for an unexpected reason, and the entire world stood in absolute disbelief, their eyes glued to the news outlets, their ears ringing with the relentless barrage of speculation that swirled around this extraordinary event. Reporters clamored for interviews. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags demanding an explanation, and political analysts from every corner of the globe pored over minute details to determine why, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, the President of the United States would oust the President of Ukraine during a scheduled diplomatic meeting. As soon as the reports broke, journalists ran breathless segments describing the scene. Mr. Zelensky standing just outside the grand White House entrance, his face a mixture of shock and anger, while Mr. Trump stood on the threshold, arms folded, jaw set, refusing to let him back inside. The cameras snapped frantically. The videos captured every fleeting nuance of fury and disbelief in Zelensky's eyes. No one had seen anything like it before. This was far beyond a diplomatic gaffe or a misunderstanding. It was an unprecedented spectacle, and the world demanded to know the precise reason, which at first remained hidden behind layers of confusion and official statements. People who witnessed this event firsthand talked about how Vice President Pence quickly stepped in to usher journalists back, how White House staff looked on, frozen in place, as if thunderstruck by the rapid sequence of events. Zelensky, who had arrived that morning brimming with optimism for negotiations on trade and military assistance, found himself abruptly ejected from the premises. It wasn't political disagreement that spurred Trump's decision, at least not in the conventional sense. There had been no mention of Ukraine's defense strategies or NATO expansion during the meltdown. The flabbergasting cause, as it later emerged, involved nothing less than a bizarre culinary dispute, one that would shake the entire sphere of international relations. But in those initial moments, all that anyone knew was that something dramatic, possibly irreparable, had just happened. Inside the Oval Office, just moments before the confrontation exploded, Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky had been sitting opposite each other, their postures guarded but courteous, exchanging pleasantries with forced smiles. Observers recall that the tension in the room was palpable from the outset. Trump, always confident, seemed unusually edgy, as if he were expecting a confrontation but wasn't sure when or why it would occur. Zelensky, on the other hand, maintained a demeanor of cautious optimism. The conversation started innocently enough, discussions of bilateral relations, potential trade deals, the usual repertoire of diplomatic chatter. At one point, however, an innocuous comment about lunch arrangements set off a peculiar chain reaction. "We are planning to serve a special Ukrainian dish this afternoon," Zelensky said, smiling at the White House staff, who were preparing to finalize the lunch menu. Perhaps our two nations could break bread together in a truly international spirit. Trump raised an eyebrow. "What kind of dish are we talking about?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Zelensky responded, "We call it holubtsi, stuffed cabbage rolls. But don't worry, Mr. President, we respect your preferences. We have alternative options if you would like something more American." Trump's eyes flickered and an awkward silence ensued. Those present said you could almost sense a sudden shift in the atmosphere. No one could fathom how a discussion about stuffed cabbage could lead to catastrophe, but the tension built precipitously. "I like to keep things simple," Trump remarked in a guarded tone, tapping his fingertips on the desk. "I'm a big fan of American cuisine steak, maybe some fast food, but let's see how it goes." In that instant, Zelensky's phone buzzed quietly. The Ukrainian president glanced down, his expression faltering for a moment. Some say he received a message from his staff, while others claim he was just checking the time. Regardless, that small gesture seemed to annoy Trump. The conversation resumed, but the mood was no longer cordial. Trump asked about certain aspects of Ukrainian agriculture, wheat exports, and possible deals with American farmers yet. The conversation quickly derailed into a discussion about the ideal shape and texture of cabbage rolls. It was almost absurd, reminiscent of an unhinged comedic sketch, but it was happening right there in the White House, with the leaders of two nations. Mr. President Zelensky ventured, attempting to steer the talk back to official matters. We also have a few crucial points to discuss regarding the security guarantee and potential defensive arms support. Trump shrugged. Yes, we'll get to that. But first about this lunch thing. Are you telling me you want me to eat stuffed cabbage? My staff told me you insisted. Zelensky looked taken aback. Insisted? No, Mr. President. We merely suggested a dish from Ukraine as a gesture of cultural exchange. I'm certainly not insisting. Trump pressed his palms flat on the resolute desk, the faint glimmer of a scowl forming on his face. I've been hearing rumors of something else, that you wanted me to try it on camera, to show off some kind of unity. Is that correct? Zelensky's eyes widened, confusion washing over his features. On camera? I wasn't aware of any plan like that. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. All the while, aides and translators hovered at the edges of the room, looking more and more uncomfortable by the second. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien cleared his throat and tried to redirect the conversation. I believe, Mr. President, that the lunch detail was a friendly suggestion from the Ukrainian delegation. Maybe we could return to the core agenda: trade deals, joint initiatives, support. Trump cut him off with a wave of his hand. Hold on, I need clarity here. He turned to Zelensky. Your embassy staff reached out to my people about capturing some positive images of us for the media. Look, I'm not opposed to that, but I don't like being blindsided. And I sure don't like being told what to eat. Zelensky frowned, frustration creeping into his voice. Mr. President, with all due respect, I have never once demanded that you eat a particular dish. I might have proposed it as a friendly option, because in Ukraine, food is a symbol of hospitality. We also plan to have American favorites on the table. Nobody told you that you had to do anything. Where is this information coming from? Trump leaned back, the leather of the chair squeaking. I got a text from one of my top advisors saying that your team insisted on a PR stunt involving some Ukrainian specialty. My staff was under the impression that you wanted us photographed trying out local dishes. And I just want to say, if you think you can come to the White House and make me do something that I might not be comfortable with, well, that's not going to happen. The tension grew like a thundercloud. Zelensky placed both hands in his lap, trying to maintain composure. I assure you, Mr. President, that none of us had any intention of forcing you into a photo op. Possibly there was a miscommunication at lower levels. Let's clarify it right now so we can move forward and talk about the things that truly matter. Trump's gaze was cold, but for a moment it seemed like the issue might be resolved. However, something in Zelensky's last statement caused a flicker of annoyance to cross Trump's face again, as though he didn't like how the Ukrainian president had called it a miscommunication at lower levels. He interpreted that phrasing as somewhat condescending, as if Zelensky was brushing aside the importance of the White House's concerns. Slowly, Trump stood up, adjusting the lapels of his jacket. Let me make one thing perfectly clear, he began, his voice low. This is my house. No one waltzes in here and tries to set me up for any kind of publicity stunt without my explicit approval. If we're going to have a friendly meal, we'll plan it properly. I don't appreciate last-minute twists. I've had enough surprises in my time as president, and I won't tolerate any more. Is that understood? Zelensky stood as well, pushing his chair back a few inches. His own frustration was mounting. Yes, sir, it is. But I have to reiterate, we never intended any such stunt. I find this whole scenario quite perplexing, and I'm a bit offended that you think we came here under false pretenses. Trump narrowed his eyes. Offended, huh? Well, you know what offends me. Being told one thing by your staff, and then hearing a different story from you. If there's a breakdown in communication, that's on you to fix. I have enough on my plate, dealing with our own domestic issues. At this point, Robert O'Brien and other aides started to shuffle uncomfortably, quietly attempting to ease the conversation back to policy. Mr. President, O'Brien said softly, we have the notes on potential defense aid. We can. Trump held up a hand. Not now. I want to sort this out first. Then he turned back to Zelensky, who was gripping the back of his chair, the frustration in his eyes plain as day. Let's get something straight, Mr. Zelensky. I value the alliance between our countries. However, respect is a two-way street. I expect transparency. I expect no surprises. And I certainly don't expect to be cornered into a media fiasco over some stuffed cabbage. Zelensky breathed in deeply, obviously trying to remain calm. Mr. President, I understand. But I repeat, I did not come here to force you into anything. Our relationship means a great deal to me and to Ukraine. If someone on my team bungled the communication, I will rectify it. I apologize for any confusion caused, but I hope you can understand that I am not responsible for every small misunderstanding that occurs. Trump's eyes flashed with anger at that remark. He wasn't used to a visiting head of state speaking so candidly in front of his team, implying that his staff might be at fault. It's your responsibility, Mr. Zelensky. The buck stops with you, right? Isn't that how leadership works? The Ukrainian president paused, then nodded slowly, trying to keep his temper in check. Yes, you are correct about leadership, and I promise you I will handle it. But can we please focus on the matters at hand? Joint defense strategies, our energy agreements, and potentially renewing certain trade partnerships. Trump took a long, measured breath. He cast a quick glance at his phone, which lay face down on the desk, as if checking for messages, then looked back at Zelensky. One more thing, he said, ignoring Zelensky's query about policy. Your wife, she tweeted something earlier about how proud she is to share Ukrainian culinary culture with the world. Now, that sounds to me like you folks definitely wanted to highlight this dish today. So, which is it? Were you planning a big reveal, or was it just an option on the lunch menu? Zelensky felt his cheeks flush with frustration. My wife, sir, is extremely proud of our cultural heritage, as any First Lady would be. However, that does not translate into a forced photo op. People often tweet about the smallest things, especially regarding cultural diplomacy. She might have wanted to celebrate Ukraine's cuisine, but that hardly equates to strong arming you into anything. Trump gave a short, mirthless laugh. Well, maybe your staff and your wife should coordinate better next time. Because the way it looks from here, you are trying to corner me into a situation I don't appreciate. Zelensky, at this point, seemed at a loss. He cast a pleading glance around the room, but the American officials stood silently, their faces grim. Some staffers from the Ukrainian delegation looked mortified. Finally, Zelensky said, Mr. President, I would like to resolve this amicably. I'll speak to my staff, you speak to yours, we clarify the miscommunication, and we move on to the real reason. I'm here, which is to strengthen our partnership. Trump folded his arms across his chest, refusing to relinquish control of the moment. Maybe we do that, he said. But right now, I'm not in the mood to talk trade deals or defense assistance. I don't like being blindsided, and I'm not sure I like your tone. Zelensky stiffened. My tone? I'm sorry if I come across as frustrated, but I think it's understandable, given the circumstances. We traveled across the ocean for these negotiations, and we want them to succeed. Well, Trump said, his voice dripping with condescension. Maybe next time don't bring me a Trojan horse disguised as a stuffed cabbage. The entire room seemed to inhale sharply. One Ukrainian aide blanched, as though physically stung by the comment. Trump wasn't done. You know what? I think this conversation is over for today. We'll reschedule if we feel like it. But for now, I suggest you take your team and step outside, because I'm not going to discuss serious matters with someone who thinks they can walk in here and set the narrative." Zelensky's lips parted, and he looked genuinely stunned. "Mr. President, please, this is a misunderstanding. There's no need for hostility." Trump shook his head. "Hostility? You haven't seen hostility. This is me telling you politely to leave. If you can't respect that, then we'll have a real problem." At that moment, an uncomfortable hush fell. Trump turned to one of his Secret Service agents near the door. "Show them out," he commanded. The agent glanced at Trump, then at Zelensky, as if checking to see if the President of the United States was absolutely serious. But Trump's expression left no room for doubt. He was resolute. Zelensky stood there, visibly trembling with anger or shock, perhaps both. Some people later claimed they saw tears of frustration brimming in his eyes, though Zelensky would never admit that publicly. He swallowed hard, then said in a hushed tone, "Very well, I'll leave. But let me just say, on behalf of Ukraine, we regret that this turned so quickly. It was never our intention." Trump didn't respond, simply waved his hand in a curt dismissal. The Secret Service agent approached the Ukrainian president and gestured toward the door. Zelensky and his delegation, almost tripping over themselves in disbelief, began to move toward the exit. Reporters stationed outside in the hallway turned their cameras on the group, capturing the pall of embarrassment and anger that radiated from them. As Zelensky stepped out of the Oval Office, an American journalist shouted, "Mr. President Zelensky, why are you leaving so soon? Is the meeting over? What happened?" Zelensky paused, clearly torn about whether to speak or not, but his composure momentarily snapped. "Ask him," he said, pointing back toward the Oval Office. "He apparently believes we came here to trick him into some publicity stunt. This is absurd." The journalists all but lost their minds. Microphones were thrust forward. Cameras zoomed in on Zelensky's face, capturing the raw frustration in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then thought better of it and simply strode off down the corridor, his aides hurrying after him. Meanwhile, inside the Oval Office, Trump exhaled sharply, then sank back into his chair. He glanced at Robert O'Brien and a handful of other advisors. "Do you see what I have to deal with?" he muttered. "I don't need that. I have enough on my plate." O'Brien swallowed, then asked in a low voice, "Sir, do you think we should do damage control or put out a statement?" Trump waved a hand dismissively. "Let them spin it how they want. The media is going to say what they say. If Zelensky wants to come back and actually show some respect, maybe we'll talk. But I'm not dealing with that kind of nonsense today. Not after everything else going on." The White House staff, shell-shocked, glanced at each other, silently considering the ramifications of this unprecedented meltdown. Word spread like wildfire through the building, eventually leaking into every major news channel and social media feed within minutes. Once outside, Zelensky wasted no time phoning his staff back in Ukraine, updating them about the fiasco. "You won't believe what just happened," he said, exasperation lacing his tone. "He kicked us out over stuffed cabbage. This is humiliating, it's petty, and it's entirely unexpected." The staff on the other end was incredulous, unsure if this was some sort of twisted joke. But Zelensky's anger made it clear that it was no joke. Eventually, the Ukrainian delegation marched out of the White House, straight past a swarm of reporters who fired off question after question. Is the Ukraine-US relationship in jeopardy? Did Mr. Trump physically threaten you? Was there a cultural misunderstanding? Zelensky shook his head, refusing to answer, though he muttered under his breath about lack of respect and futile arguments. Once in their vehicles, the Ukrainian team sped away from the grounds, the media trailing in their wake. The world erupted in discussion, rumor, and condemnation. People on Twitter joked that perhaps Trump hated cabbage or had some bizarre allergy. Others thought Zelensky must have insulted Trump personally. Conspiracy theorists claimed it was all an orchestrated spectacle to distract from bigger issues. Meanwhile, official statements from the White House were sparse, simply indicating a postponement of discussions due to logistical disagreements. Zelensky's office issued a brief statement that communication errors had created an unfortunate environment, leading to the abrupt conclusion of the meeting. None of the official lines came close to explaining the raw drama that had actually unfolded. Behind closed doors, Trump fumed about the entire situation. "I don't like it," he told his inner circle. "I look like the bad guy now, but they were the ones trying to pull a fast one." Some of his advisors tried to placate him, suggesting they quickly reschedule a more positive meeting to mend fences. Trump refused, at least for the moment, feeling that Zelensky had disrespected him. As for Zelensky, he confided in his foreign minister that he had never expected such volatility, especially over something as trivial as a lunch menu. If he didn't want to eat holubtsi, he could have just said so. Why turn it into a massive controversy? "We had important matters to discuss." The foreign minister tried to calm him, but the sense of humiliation lingered. The next day, as newspapers across the globe carried blazing headlines like "Trump boots Zelensky in shocking showdown and cabbage catastrophe wrecks diplomatic meeting," the tension only mounted. The comedic element of the reason behind the fallout ignited 1,000 memes, but the underlying severity was not lost on seasoned diplomats. Many expressed concern that this rift could undermine cooperation on critical issues such as defense aid, economic partnerships, and support against potential aggression from powerful neighbors. Inside Ukraine, citizens were furious. Some believed Trump had disrespected their leader and their national pride. Others blamed Zelensky for not handling the situation more tactfully. Politicians in Ukraine's parliament were split along partisan lines, with some calling for a formal complaint, others urging a more measured approach to preserve U.S. support. In the United States, Trump's supporters praised him for standing up to what they perceived as a manipulative setup. His critics lambasted the president for a lack of diplomatic decorum, arguing that even if there had been a misunderstanding, a skillful leader would have resolved it calmly without resorting to such a public ejection. Amid the chaos, White House staff worked feverishly to manage the fallout. Sarah, a communications coordinator, was tasked with drafting a statement that would help justify Trump's actions without appearing too belligerent. She labored over every word, trying to convey that the president felt ambushed, but that the administration still valued the partnership with Ukraine. After numerous revisions, she ended up with a press release, emphasizing ongoing dialogues and mutual respect, but also hinting that protocol was not followed. The subtext was clear. Zelensky's team had violated some unwritten rule, thereby justifying Trump's response. However, this ambiguous explanation only fueled speculation, prompting more reporters to dig deeper, eventually uncovering that the entire meltdown seemed to revolve around stuffed cabbage and a rumored photo op. This sent the media into a frenzy. Late-night talk show hosts had a field day, mocking the bizarre nature of the dispute. Jokes ranged from, "Did the stuffed cabbage stuff up diplomacy?" to "What's next?" WWII triggered by Borscht. The comedic commentary, however, did nothing to quell the serious concerns of international relations experts. The perspective of the Ukrainian side also gained traction. Leaked memos from Ukraine's embassy in Washington suggested that they had merely proposed a cultural dish as part of the official lunch menu, and that at no point had they demanded Trump's participation in a staged photo opportunity. One memo stated explicitly, "We understand the president's preference for American dishes. It would be an honor if he tries our national cuisine, but there is no obligation." Such revelations painted a picture of a massive misunderstanding or possibly overreaction on the American side. The question then became, which advisor told Trump that Zelensky was trying to force him into a photo op? The rumor mill churned, with certain sources suggesting that someone within Trump's administration was either incompetent or had deliberately sabotaged the meeting, possibly due to their own agenda or personal bias. The name of a certain junior advisor popped up repeatedly, but no one could confirm the details. Meanwhile, Trump refused to admit any fault. In an interview with a conservative radio host, he stated, "Look, I was disrespected. I don't like it, okay? When a foreign leader comes into the White House and tries to push me around, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm the President of the United States. You have to understand, we stand for respect in this country. If they want to do deals with us, they have to understand who's in charge." Zelensky also went on record in a televised Ukrainian interview, "I respect the United States, and I respect the office of the President, but we cannot allow misinformation to derail critical diplomatic efforts. We flew to Washington with every intention of fostering a positive dialogue. We were met with hostility and baseless accusations that we intended to force some kind of silly culinary show. It's insulting, not just to me, but to the entire Ukrainian people." Observing the fiasco from abroad, other world leaders cringed at the deteriorating relationship between two allies. A well-known European diplomat quipped off the record, "If they can't handle lunch, how are they going to handle joint security?" Pressure mounted for both sides to resolve the spat. Advisors from various departments in the USSTATE department and Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs began quiet, backdoor negotiations to salvage the situation. Eventually, an idea emerged: schedule a conciliatory phone call between Trump and Zelensky, orchestrated so carefully that no mention of lunch, cabbage, or photo ops would even surface. Instead, it would be a platform to reaffirm mutual interests and begin paving the way for a new meeting under strict guidelines. Zelensky's team was hesitant, given the public humiliation, but they recognized the importance of maintaining good relations with the U.S. So, a few days after the notorious incident, the phone rang in Zelensky's office in KYIV. After a moment's hesitation, he picked up. "Mr. President," Trump said, his tone measured, possibly even contrite. "How are you?" Zelensky took a small breath. "I'm fine, thank you. And you?" There was a pause. Those present on Zelensky's side of the conversation strained to hear any hint of apology. Trump cleared his throat. I'm doing well. I think we should talk about our shared goals, defense, security. We both got a lot on the line." Zelensky nodded to his aides. "Yes, we certainly do. I would appreciate that." Another pause. Then Trump went on. "I want to make sure we don't let any more misunderstandings get in the way of our relationship. We've always valued Ukraine, and I know you want the best for your country." Zelensky felt a mix of relief and lingering resentment, but he kept his voice calm. "That is correct. I want only the best for our two nations. Let's proceed with constructive dialogue. We can schedule a new meeting under terms agreeable to both sides." Trump agreed, though he didn't overtly apologize for kicking Zelensky out. Nonetheless, the phone call was a start, a small step toward patching up the massive rift. Diplomats scrambled to craft a narrative of renewed cooperation and regrettable confusion, though neither side definitively explained the exact cause of the meltdown. Privately, however, there was talk that Trump's emotional reaction was triggered not just by the stuffed cabbage rumor, but also by a barrage of political pressure he had been facing domestically. Some speculated that any minor annoyance would have lit his fuse that day, and Zelensky's lunch suggestion just happened to be the spark. On the Ukrainian side, officials quietly vowed never again to surprise any American president with exotic food proposals, no matter how well-intentioned, without triple-checking that the White House was fully informed. Over time, the shock began to fade from public discourse, replaced by other headlines and crises. Yet the incident left a permanent mark on the Trump-Zelensky relationship. Even after they resumed diplomatic talks, a certain guardedness lingered, an invisible fence erected to prevent any possible whiff of cultural ambush. Months later, in a rare candid moment, Zelensky confided to a fellow European leader, "I was absolutely stunned. If we had any idea it would cause such an uproar, we wouldn't have brought the dish up at all. But it's a lesson learned. In politics, sometimes the smallest things can trigger the biggest explosions. That European leader replied sympathetically, "Yes, these days it seems that misunderstandings can spiral out of control if not managed swiftly. But I suppose the moral of the story is always to confirm the menu well in advance." Zelensky gave a wry smile. "Indeed. And maybe keep the cameras out of the dining room." Meanwhile, from Trump's perspective, the fiasco validated his belief in controlling the optics at all costs. According to some White House sources, he would occasionally remark in private that Zelensky's visit was a classic example of how quickly something innocent can blow up. "I don't regret standing my ground." Yet in quieter circles, the fiasco became something of an embarrassing anecdote. Staffers would recall that day with a mixture of horror and reluctant amusement. They whispered that the real reason the fiasco started was because someone misread an internal memo, thinking that the Ukrainian side demanded a live-streamed tasting session featuring the president. In reality, the memo only mentioned a polite invitation to sample a Ukrainian specialty if desired. This catastrophic misreading was the match that lit the fuse. But such details never emerged in an official capacity, leaving the broader public to accept some half-true version of events. Ironically, the dish at the center of it all, halupsi, became momentarily famous worldwide. Restaurants from New York to Tokyo started putting it on their menus as the dish that shook diplomacy. Ukrainian diaspora communities found themselves explaining the recipe to curious patrons. Some even joked that the stuffed cabbage deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for drawing so much attention, albeit negative, to Ukrainian culture. From these comedic ashes, a peculiar fascination grew around cross-cultural cuisine. Academics wrote papers on how small cultural gestures can be misinterpreted in high-stakes diplomacy. One scholar even published an article entitled "From Cabbage Rolls to Catastrophe, a Study in Diplomatic Communication Errors." As time passed, the memory of that day lingered mostly in the form of comedic relief, overshadowed by bigger geopolitical storms. Ukraine and the U.S. eventually found ways to work together again, driven by mutual interests too strong to be derailed indefinitely by a single blow-up. But whenever Zelensky visited Washington afterward, even post-Trump presidency, there was an unspoken rule among his team: always triple-check the lunch menu with the State Department. No improvised gastronomic surprises, no cultural revelations without prior notice. Because they all remembered that day too vividly, the day the president of Ukraine was literally shown the door over a misunderstanding about a plate of stuffed cabbage. Looking back at the fiasco, the most human element of it all was the raw emotion displayed by both leaders' frustration, pride, and the desperate need to avoid looking weak or manipulated in front of their respective audiences. For a moment, the pomp and protocol of international diplomacy fell away, revealing two men who were, in essence, dealing with a universal conflict of being misunderstood. Except in their case, the stakes were astronomically higher. The American president felt cornered, whether by reality or by miscommunication. The Ukrainian president felt disrespected, denied the chance to discuss urgent matters of national importance. The result was a shocking, dramatic confrontation that momentarily rocked the global political landscape. It's said that after the dust settled, both men reflected privately on how to avoid similar fiascos. Trump, for all his bravado, reportedly told a close confidant, "I wish that day had gone differently. But I'm not going to apologize for standing firm." Zelensky, on the other side, might have mused, "I wish we had clarified everything beforehand. But I will not apologize for offering our culture in a spirit of friendship." And so, the schism slowly healed, though a scar remained a reminder that in the realm of high-stakes diplomacy, even the simplest gestures can incite chaos if misread. The world, having watched the spectacle, shook its collective head in disbelief, learning yet again how fragile international relationships can be in the modern era of instant media coverage and heightened sensitivities. Over time, the story became an infamous anecdote, passed along by White House interns and Ukrainian diplomats alike, always preceded by a chuckle and followed by a sigh. The question that lingered in people's minds was whether the conflict could have been avoided if cooler heads had prevailed, if there had been a modicum of grace or a single clarifying conversation before tensions boiled over. In the end, the entire event served as a cautionary tale about how one small spark, whether it's stuffed cabbage or a misunderstood memo, can ignite a diplomatic firestorm. As the months rolled on, numerous other political dramas grabbed the headlines, but for those who witnessed that day firsthand, the memory never faded. They recalled the look on Zelensky's face as Secret Service guided him to the exit, the unyielding set of Trump's jaw, the hush that fell over the entire West Wing, and the stunned gasps of the journalists outside. Indeed, it was a spectacle for the ages, an encounter that seemed ripped straight from a political satire, except that it was real, raw, and so astonishingly petty that it threw the world off balance for a moment. Thus ends the bizarre but undeniably captivating tale of how Mr. Trump kicked Mr. Zelensky out of the White House for an unexpected reason, shocking the world and reminding everyone that diplomacy, like any human endeavor, can be derailed by the oddest of misunderstandings. And though both men eventually walked their separate paths toward other challenges and controversies, that single incident stood out as a stark lesson. Sometimes, the biggest international firestorms can start with the smallest, most mundane sparks, even something as innocuous as a simple stuffed cabbage dish.